Abraham Lincoln was long credited with being the, quote, Great Emancipator, end quote, and the anti-slavery president. He was in fact quite openly racist and often expressed the belief in keeping America a nation of, by, and for white people. On December 31st, 1862, he signed an agreement with one Bernard Koch to take 435 black so-called contrabands to El Avache, I'm sorry about that pronunciation, a satellite island off the coast of Haiti. The next day, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but the fact that he had also negotiated a colonization scheme, which he had likely intended to accompany and complement the proclamation, is widely unknown. Lincoln is a quintessential American hero. Much of the mythology surrounding him is worse than sympathetic exaggeration. Lincoln lore is mostly made up of lies. One of his most outspoken detractors was radical abolitionist Wendell Phillips. Lincoln's continued advocacy of colonization, the forced migration of black people out of the country, inspired Phillips to call him, quote, a first-rate, second-rate man, end quote. Lincoln was a consummate politician. He had to be dragged kicking and screaming to fight a war to end slavery, and ultimately went to war only to save the Union. The Republican Party was founded to prevent the spread of slavery into the Western territories, not necessarily abolish it. Abraham Lincoln made it quite clear that he had no intention of ending slavery where it already existed. Yet his attempts to continue the compromises of the previous 100 years were not enough to keep the slaveocracy mollified. They struck first by Lincoln's design to attract public support for the Union as defender rather than aggressor at Fort Sumter, South Carolina in 1861. Lincoln is often remembered as the man who personally prosecuted the war and insisted on the defeat of the Confederacy. It is true that he sat by the telegraph and eagerly awaited news of battles. He did fire underperforming generals and lament when they didn't pursue the Confederates. But he would have done none of those things if the Confederates hadn't rebuffed his efforts to compensate them in exchange for their freed slaves, or if he hadn't reneged on his promise not to tamper with the institution where it existed. Most important, he would never have finally waged a war of abolition if the enslaved themselves had not forced him to do so. On May 21, 1861, 3 enslaved men, Shepard Mallory, Frank Baker, and James Townsend, rowed across the James River in Virginia into Union-held territory at Fort Monroe. Despite federal policy, which required that they be returned to their slaveholder, General Benjamin Butler decided to keep them as contraband of war. The Lincoln administration chose not to punish Butler, and in the ensuing weeks more runaways turned up at Fort Monroe. Within a month, 500 men, women and children had taken refuge there. As the war dragged on, the enslaved began freeing themselves wherever Union forces appeared. While Northerners debated whether the war was being fought over slavery, the enslaved answered in the affirmative and declared that there was no turning back. There could be no more waffling about whether the Union should maintain slavery. The Union could only be restored without slavery, and the North would have to defeat the South militarily to do it. Phillips made clear that if it could be said that Lincoln had grown, it was because, quote, we watered him, end quote. He was, quote, watered, end quote, by Confederate intransigence and the determination of enslaved to become free. Lincoln is remembered as a martyr in large part because he was assassinated immediately after the war ended. It is easy to see him as heroic precisely because of how he was killed. In support of the fugitive slave law, Lincoln stated, quote, we are under legal obligation to catch and return the runaway slaves. I confess I hate to see them hunted down and carried back to their stripes and unrequited toil, but I bite my lips and keep quiet, end quote. Phillips again responded, calling Lincoln the, quote, slave hound of Illinois, end quote. Lincoln told black people to their faces that they should leave the country and blame them and their presence for the Civil War. Lincoln never gave up his dream of colonization, a dream of fulfilling the settler colonial project and making America a nation for Anglo-Saxons. He established an office to promote colonization within the Interior Department and hired the Reverend James Mitchell to develop a colonization plan. naming him the U.S. Commissioner of Negro Colonization. One colony nearly came to fruition in the Chiriquí region of Panama until Central American governments protested. Mitchell wrote Lincoln the, quote, letter on the relation of the white and African races in the United States, showing the necessity of the colonization of the latter, end quote. Mitchell didn't mince words, encouraging the president on the first of 28 pages, quote, to produce the separation of those races, the removal of the colored race to a proper locality, and establishment in independence there, end quote. On August 14th, 1862, Lincoln met with a group of 5 black pastors selected by Mitchell and told them that he wanted them and their people out of the country. Quote, but for your race among us, there could not be war, although many men engaged on either side do not care for you one way or the other. Nevertheless, I repeat, without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a bias, the war could not have an existence, end quote. This determination to carry out a plan of ethnic cleansing had very dangerous repercussions for black people who lived a precarious existence whether or not they were enslaved or free. At the time of Lincoln's meeting with the, quote, intelligent colored men, end quote, a wave of violence was falling upon black communities around the country. On August 6, 1862, the New York Tribune reported that violence, quote, commenced weeks ago in Cincinnati, Evansville, Indiana, and Toledo, end quote. In Brooklyn, a mob attacked black workers at a tobacco factory and attempted to burn it down, with the workers inside. Lincoln was nothing if not consistent. After his meeting with black leaders after violent attacks on black people, he continued to link emancipation to colonization. On September 23, 1862, he met with his cabinet to discuss a preliminary emancipation proclamation and made clear his determination to send black people out of the country. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles reported on the meeting, quote, this was a part of the president's scheme and had occupied his mind for some time before the project for emancipation was adopted, although the historians, biographers, and commentators have made slight, if any, allusion to it. The president, however, and the portion of his cabinet considered them inseparable, and that deportation should accompany and be part of the emancipation movement, end quote. Not only was emancipation tied to colonization, but so was compensation to the slaveholders, which Lincoln proposed in his congressional address of December 1, 1862, while giving them until January 1, 1900, to complete the process of emancipation. So dedicated are historians to whitewashing history that they lie about evidence that is quite easy to find. Benjamin Butler's account of being asked to develop yet another colonization plan just days before Lincoln's assassination is continually called into question. Anyone questioning whether Lincoln was, quote, the Great Emancipator, end quote, is rebuffed. He may have said in his second inaugural address in March 1865, quote, if God wills that the Civil War continue until all the wealth piled on the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, end quote. But it was the insistence of the slave and former slaves themselves, of radical abolitionists, and of intransigent Confederates that forced him to utter such words shortly before he died. It is imperative that we debunk the myth that Lincoln acted initially out of a motivation to help black people. Spreading and continuing these falsehoods makes the study of history a sham and keeps Americans uninformed about their past and their present. And that was by Margaret Kimberley from her most recent book, Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. And you can find Margaret Kimberley's writings on the blackagendareport.com.